Second interview, Shane, another great one. Will Miles, Read and Reaction, Gators Breakdown. Check out his website. He does a hell of a job. He's breaking down this epic game, Florida hosting Utah. All right, we're pleased to once again be joined by Will Miles. Of course, you know him from readandreaction.com, the Stand Up and Holler. He's the host of Stand Up and Holler. He contributes to Gators Breakdown, the outstanding Gator show, and you got to give him a follow at Will Miles SEC. Will, thank you so much for joining me once again.
No, I appreciate it. It's always fun. It's like you said before before we went live. It's nice to talk about football finally. It seems like it takes forever, and then it goes by so quick. So you got to appreciate it when it's here.
Yeah, well, I know you don't want to talk recruiting, and neither do I because the games are right around the corner. But I wanted to start with this real quick. How thankful are you that the Gators did not hire Scott Frost?
Well, I mean, I last year I tongue in cheek came up with an award called the Kirby Award because Kirby Smart always seemed to sort of, put his foot in his mouth when it was time for a big game, and he almost did for me last year against Alabama in the SEC championship game. Obviously, made up for it on the back end in the national championship game, but I think Frost won it like 4 or 5 times last year, and he's on pace again already. It's funny. I actually have no problem with the onside kick that everybody has a problem with. The problem I have with Frost is that he then went on the podium and was like, well, now that I've seen the result, I guess I wouldn't do it again. And I'm like, boy, is that terrible process when you're making decisions. That's how you end up losing 8 straight 1-score games or whatever it is there in Lincoln. So I got a buddy who's a Nebraska fan, so I text him pretty much every Saturday my condolences, and I'm happy with where Florida ended up. That's for sure.
Well, over at Read and Reaction, one of your most recent pieces, you talked about the SEC East and how the Gators, where were they voted? 4th, I think, in the media poll.
Yep.
But that's not how I voted. And I don't know if you knew this, Will, but we have the exact same SEC East predictions, which caught a lot of people off guard. Florida number 2 and Kentucky number 5. Why is it that based on your research that you think Florida could do as well as number 2?
Well, I mean, I think what you look at when you look at the SEC, regardless of what stat you're looking at, I chose to look at EPA, which is expected points added. I also looked at yards per play in the article. But regardless of what metric you look at, what happens is Georgia and Alabama have clearly separated themselves, both on offense and defense. And then there's just this grouping of teams that sort of all sat in the same place. And the records last year were completely dictated by essentially who performed well in close games. So Tennessee performed poorly in close games. I think they were 1-3. Florida was 1-4. And then you look at Kentucky and they were 5-1. You look at Ole Miss, they were 2-0. So these teams that for all the advanced metrics sort of sat in a little cluster separated themselves from a record perspective because of their success in close games. And then you go look at who those teams are bringing back. And I think you look at a team like Tennessee, who's bringing back Hendon Hooker, and I have a lot of confidence in Hooker. I went to Virginia Tech as well, so I pay attention to them. So I paid attention to Hooker when he was there. He played really well at Virginia Tech, and then took a step up last year once Tennessee finally put him in the lineup. But I think Florida was kind of fortunate to catch him early on in the season last year. And then you look at Kentucky, and yeah, they've got Will Levis coming back, but Wan'Dale Robinson's leaving. They lost 2 offensive linemen who were starters to the NFL. Their running back is suspended, I think, for the first 3 games of the year, and one of those games is coming to the Swamp. And then their defense, Josh Paschal was a huge part of that defense, able to be really versatile linebacker, a 2nd-round pick in the NFL draft. So where are they improving if they're already in this cluster? And I think that's sort of the thing that I look at is from last year's stats, you've got this cluster of teams and who's taking a step forward, who's taking a step back. I think anybody who watched any of Florida last year knows that if Anthony Richardson's healthy, they've taken a step forward. And that's really the question, I think, for Florida is Richardson going to be able to stay healthy? Because Jack Miller, the backup, broke his thumb, so he's out for a little while. And if Richardson gets hurt, then Florida's obviously going to struggle. Those were sort of, but it wasn't really a hard decision for me. It was Florida or Tennessee, 2 or 3. I think those are clearly the 2nd and 3rd best teams in the East, given the quarterback play that we're probably going to get from them, and given the limitations of South Carolina, Kentucky, Missouri, and Vanderbilt. The hardest choice I actually had when it came to those Final 4 was I think Vanderbilt. I picked them 0-8, but that's because I'm not quite sure how far they've come in 1 year, but I think Vanderbilt may come up and snipe somebody, may even end up in front of Missouri.
So what is the biggest question you have for the Gators entering the season that we just cannot answer till we see them on the field?
Defensive line. Their defensive line was terrible last year. It was terrible 2 years ago. They've been in the bottom half, actually, really the bottom third of the country, not just the SEC, but the country in terms of rushing yards allowed per play, in terms of expected points added, all the different statistics you look at, even if you just look at total rushing yards. The LSU game last year was not an anomaly. They got run over, and that was pretty much what happened all year long. They had brought in 3 transfer defensive tackles last year to sort of plug the holes, and that was sort of a MO of Dan Mullen and his staff. They brought in a lot of transfers at defensive tackle. Adam Schuler was the guy they brought in from West Virginia, and he actually turned out to be a really, really good player. The problem is that the 3 guys they brought in last year were just sort of meh. They were okay, but they weren't great, and the defensive line got run over. And I think that's really the big question for Florida is you've got Gervon Dexter. Everybody expects him to step up into a bigger role this year, but they're also kind of talking about moving him out towards end, kind of where Zachary Carter played. You got Desmond Watson, who's a real big guy in the center, but a big guy. And he's one of those people who you're not going to be able to put out there for 50, 60, 70 plays. And so you start looking at the depth at defensive line, and there's just no experience there. And so Florida is going to have guys step up. A guy like Chris McClellan, who's a true freshman, top 100 recruit, but he's like the 4th guy listed at defensive tackle, at least in the 2 interior spots for this Florida defense. I don't necessarily want a true freshman as my 4th guy in the depth chart up front when I'm going to face Alabama and Texas A&M later in the year. So some guys who haven't gotten a lot of playing time are going to have to step up. And, the quality of the transfer play from last year was not significant enough to give me a whole lot of confidence that's going to happen. And so I do think Florida's going to struggle to stop the run. I think they'll be better against the pass this year than they were last year. So I think the defense will probably overall take a step up. But that's the question to me is defensive line. And they've had a couple of linebackers leave as well. In fact, one of them coming back this weekend. So, but those linebackers who've left, look, you lose a lot of your front 7 with those transfers who left, the linebackers who left. And now the question is, how do you replace them? And the good news is that the front 7 wasn't very good last year. So if you're replacing guys, at least you don't know. But that's the thing you just won't know till the snaps come, is have Patrick Toney, have the guys on the defensive side of the ball been able to secure that space. And they just brought Christopher Thomas back. He had been essentially cut, and they brought him back, which I think is a pretty bad sign in terms of what might be going on there on the defensive line.
Well, considering opening weekend is, maybe aside from Ohio State, Notre Dame, the biggest game in the country, you got a new coach, it's at home. What's the level of enthusiasm and energy and excitement for this season opener? When's the last time Florida fan base has been this fired up for a season opener?
Well, so first off, you're missing Bo Nix coming back to play Georgia. I'm excited for that one just because I think Georgia wins that game, but I think it's probably a lot closer than people think, and I'm going to enjoy that one. But no, I mean, look, it's a brand new coach. The recruiting has picked up over the last month. And so the thing that was missing with Dan Mullen was not, did people think he could win a game when he had equivalent players? And he kept everybody motivated. The thing that was missing from Dan Mullen was the hope that he was building the program into something else. And we basically got the exact same recruiting class every year and got the exact same results every year until everything kind of fell apart last year. With Napier, that doesn't look to be the case. It looks like he's building. His transition recruiting class was around 89. This one's right around 92 right now. The question is, can he keep building that? But these games are sort of that next step in that build. And so everybody's coming in with hope that he's building things, with hope that he's building up to the Georgias and the Alabamas and the SEC. And this is that first step. And look, you can't get any better than a top 10 opponent. And in your home place, especially when it's somebody who's from Utah, who's like pumping in humidity into their indoor practice facility to try to simulate what's going to go on in Gainesville. I've lived there for an extended period of time. You don't simulate that weather. Like, you start cramping up the minute you walk outside of the house. And that's actually the thing that I think is going to be difficult for Utah, is you come out and you're all hyped up, and the first quarter, they may get up, and they're probably going to have to, because I sort of liken it to a sprinter. If you're a sprinter who's running a longer race, you start out with too fast of a pace, and all of a sudden everybody else catches up to you. And when it's time to really put the pedal to the metal, you don't have anything left. And I think that's kind of, if Florida can keep it close going into the late third, early fourth quarter, I think that might be some of the things that you see, is that the swamp actually becomes a real advantage from the standpoint of just the weather and the attrition that you feel when you're in that kind of weather.
How big of a concern is Utah's tight ends? I just had Steven Lassen on the show from Athlon Sports. Athlon's got the Utah tight end as an All-American, and he says the other tight end is is outstanding as well.
Yeah, I mean they're both awesome. I mean, at the end of the day, that's a huge part of what Utah is going to try to do. Now, I don't know what that means though for Florida, because one of the things you see when you watch Utah, even when you watch the games against like USC, where Rising was awesome, and you watch the game against Ohio State, where he was really really good until he got injured. When you look at those games, Utah was not blitzing 80-yard, 70-yard, 60-yard plays. And if you actually look at the stats, they were 14th in 10-plus-yard plays, but then they were 54th in 20-yard plays and 100th in 30-plus-yard plays. So I think Florida's going to be okay giving them stuff over the middle to the tight ends, allowing them to sort of first down their way down the field and saying, look, if it takes you 5 minutes to go all the way down the field and the defense doesn't break and maybe we hold you to a field goal, we're okay with that. And there are going to be some times where the tight ends are going to win the battles. But the question is, Florida's problem last year was not that a tight end caught the ball over the middle and won a battle. The problem was they would like forget to guard a guy on the left-hand side, and all of a sudden Tennessee's streaking for 75 yards for a touchdown. I think Mordecai McDaniel's still standing there in the swamp from that game against Tennessee last year. That has been Florida's problem historically. And so if Patrick Toney and if Billy Napier have been able to build in the discipline they've been talking about all offseason, I'm worried about the tight ends from the standpoint of, yes, they're really good, but I think it actually plays into the fact that Florida's weakness is not necessarily guarding a guy who's not going to be able to take it to the house anyway. It's when you get a guy like, a Najee Harris a couple years ago, when you get guys like Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith, those are guys Florida just hasn't been able to guard and probably doesn't have the horses to guard extensively. But I don't think Utah is bringing those guys to the swamp. So again, I think the tight ends are going to do well. I think they're probably going to have a touchdown catch or two. I think there's going to be a lot of third down conversions where Florida's getting where the crowd's getting hyped and gets quieted down because you get a 14, 15-yard pass. But as long as they avoid that 50, 60, 70-yard dagger, I think Florida will be okay.
What's your expectations for Anthony Richardson in this game? Would you limit his quarterback runs, or do you think this is going to be such a tough game where he basically just has to go all out for the Gators to get the win?
I mean, I think that's the story all year long. I think one of the reasons that Napier brought in Jack Miller is he realized he was going to have to run Richardson in order to be successful, and that's not going to change. Florida's really thin at wide receiver. They're really thin at tight end, which is a position that Napier really likes, and they're really young at running back when you think about Montrell Johnson, who was at Louisiana with Napier, but you've got Lorenzo Lingard, who's been in the Florida program for a couple of years, but hasn't gotten a ton of carries, and then Naquan Wright's coming in off of a pretty significant injury during the Florida State game last year. So a lot of unproven guys at running back, thin at wide receiver, thin at tight end. You're going to have to take advantage of the fact that Richardson is your biggest mismatch on every single snap. And he does have the capability to take the ball 80 yards. And so, the ideal scenario for Florida, I think, is, Utah takes the ball, goes, 70 yards in 6 minutes and 50 seconds, stalls out around the 8 or 9 yard line, kicks a field goal. Ball comes back to Florida. 4 plays later, Richardson breaks a 65-yard run. Like, those are the kinds of things that Florida's going to have to do to win this game. They're going to have explosive plays, more explosive plays than Utah does. And Richardson is the best player that Florida has to get those plays done. So I think the expectation is that they will use him to run probably early more than late. And more than anything, I think to make sure that Utah has to commit an extra guy towards Richardson, and then you can start doing some misdirection. The scheme that Napier's bringing in, where they have a zone blocking scheme up front now, very similar to like those Terrell Davis teams in the NFL with John Elway when he was there, when they won a couple of Super Bowls. The goal is to get the running back on the edge and then put his foot in the ground and go and get big explosive plays from those running backs. But if you have a guy like Richardson coming out on a bootleg on the back end, well, now you've got a myriad of different things you can do. And so I don't think he's going to discourage Richardson from running. I think what he's going to say is, don't lower your head, don't lower your shoulder and run into somebody just for the sake of running into him. But if it's open on the boot, go take it. You're our best open field runner. You have to do that. And I don't think he's going to limit him. I don't think he's going to put the handcuffs on him. I think really Florida's not winning this game if Anthony Richardson goes down. But Florida's not winning this game if Anthony Richardson's not Anthony Richardson. And so there's going to have to be that balance. And, you're going to have to tell him to go out of bounds every once in a while. You have to tell him not to lower his shoulder, but I don't think you can take away the rushing component, because just like Rising, right? I mean, Rising, surprisingly, I think, when you watch him play, there's a lot more tape on him out there, but the plays that Rising makes it really kill you are like the 8, 9, 10-yard runs that extend drives. And, he ran for like 7 yards an attempt last year. Richardson was up around 8. So those are the things that kill you, and you're going to have to do that.
All right, moment of truth, Will. I don't know if you're ready to do this, but I'm not putting this out till Thursday, but do you got a prediction? Who's winning this football game? Does Florida win the first game of the Billy Napier era?
Yeah, I think they do. I think this is one of these things where when you really look at the advanced stats, I would have been surprised if you told me on offense that Utah and Florida averaged the exact same yards per play against FBS opponents last year, considering that Utah scored almost a touchdown more. I would have been really surprised before looking at the statistics. And if you'd have told me that Florida and Utah were 0.1 yards per play allowed apart when it comes to the defensive side of the ball, again, I would have been surprised. These are two very equivalent teams from last year, and Utah's losing quite a bit. I mean, when you think about it, they're returning 17 starters, but only 6 on defense. They got Devin Lloyd and Nefi Sewell, the starting linebackers who are leaving or who've left. You've got free safety Vontae Davis. You've got a guy in Muhammad Diabate who's coming from Florida to Utah, but that rushing defense for Florida last year, Diabate was a big part of why that rushing defense wasn't very good. And then you've got the Anthony Richardson upgrade. I mean, the reality is Florida left a lot of points on the field last year because Emory Jones was not either willing or able to get the ball downfield. Anybody who watched the bowl game against Central Florida who was a Florida fan was incredibly frustrated because he couldn't hit guys deep. He was just overthrowing them the entire time. Richardson seems to hit those. And then the other thing that got frustrating in a game, the one specifically that jumps out to me is the Kentucky game. He just refused to go downfield, and Kentucky was able to compress. And it was really enlightening because when Richardson came in the game for a few plays, they all of a sudden backed off. And you could tell that they knew that Richardson was the guy who was going to try to drive the dagger home, and Mullen never allowed him to do it in that game, or at least it didn't open up in that game. But you could tell that they played those quarterbacks differently. And I think that, to me, is the difference in the game. You're home. I already mentioned earlier the idea that in the third and the fourth quarter, Napier's going to run the ball early. If Florida can keep it close, then I think in the fourth quarter, they're going to be able to I think they're going to be able to take advantage of some of the deficiencies that Utah has on the defensive side of the ball and put it away. But it's going to be a close game. It's going to be a really good game. I don't anticipate this is one where like a team's going to jump out 14-0 or 17-0 or something like that. I think they're just really close. And, obviously Utah's coming in as a top 10 team. Florida's not ranked, but that's based on records last year. It's not based on stats from last year. And when you look at the stats, and particularly when you look at the film, Florida's going to kill people with explosive plays this year. Utah's going to kill people by going down the field. And I think in the first game of the year, when execution is how you're going to win, and that's really what we're saying about Utah, or explosive plays, and then, hey, 3 or 4 plays are going to be flubs, and then all of a sudden you hit a big one. Those teams, I think, are more apt to win the early games when a mistake can kill you. If Utah brings in a new, they got to replace free safety Vontae Davis. If the new free safety comes up too far, Richardson hits that dagger behind him, all of a sudden Florida's got a lead, and it's just one play. And I don't think Utah has that ability, or at least hasn't shown that ability to have that one play to put the dagger in the heart. And so you're going to need that when you come on the road to Florida.
Well, just some outstanding stuff, Will. I really appreciate all this Florida knowledge. Can you tell the audience where's the best place to find all your work?
Best place, readandreaction.com. The moniker there is curiosity applied to college football. So trying to take a different look at things within college football. Like you said, there's an SEC preview up there. Going to have the Florida-Utah preview up there before this goes live. And so you can go over and check that out. A lot of the stats I've cited here are things I'm working on for that preview. And we have a YouTube channel as well. So the Read and Reaction YouTube channel, Stand Up and Holler is the podcast we have on there. It's definitely Florida specific, but it's supposed to sort of mimic a PTI feel where we've got 4 different topics every week we're talking about. So, look, if you're a Florida fan, you're not going to, I don't think you're going to find better stuff out there, obviously. But I think if you're a football fan, you'll hopefully learn something and enjoy it, even if you're not a Florida fan.
Well, thanks again, Will. This was outstanding. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Mike, thanks so much. Appreciate you having me.
And he's got Florida winning. So,
of course he does. This is the Homer podcast, man. we ain't gonna have no Debbie Downers on here.
To me, this is the best game of the weekend, Shane, because it really is a coin flip. We've been hyping up Florida. We know everyone else has been hyping up Utah. Cannot wait for this matchup. And again, Will really delivered here.
Absolutely. Going to be such a fun game to watch, and it's a true testament, I think, of the power of the SEC. So, and just, again, see a new coach, see a new team in action.